Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Telika McCoy and I want to wish you a happy Juneteenth 2021. Today marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas to announce freedom. It was 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And so there were persons still enslaved. They were still operating as slaves until June 19th, 1865. And so this is the day that commemorates that announcement. And when you think about the 4th of July, when so many people celebrate freedom, please remember there are groups of people who don't necessarily consider that to be the day of freedom. They believe that June 19th, 1865 was the true day of freedom, when their ancestors were set free, if you will, from bondage. Now, last year, if you were with me, I talked about a woman by the name of Harriet Jacobs. She was enslaved in Edenton, North Carolina. She wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and she wrote under the name Linda Brent because she did not want people to know that she herself, Harriet Jacobs, had written those words. And so the reason for that presentation on last year, June 19th, 2020, was so that as we consider our celebrations, whether it's barbecues and we wear our paraphernalia and we commemorate this day, we celebrate this day, that we remember what slavery really looked like in America. And so I talked about Harriet Jacobs. Well, this year I want to talk to you about a man by the name of Henry Brown. Henry Brown. Now he gained this nickname. The nickname is Box. Henry Box Brown. Has anyone ever heard of Henry Box Brown? Okay, well, some people have. Well, understand that this man was born and he was enslaved. He was born in 1815. And I just want to share a few points about his life from his book, Narrative of the Life of Henry Box. Henry Box Brown, and I'm going to be sure to let you know why he got that name Box, okay, or the Box. So I'm going to read a few things from his narrative just so that, again, we can be reminded that we understand some of what the slave experience looks like, because there are narratives available to us. So if you have a bit of time, why don't you stay with me? So he says that he was born about 45 miles from the city of Richmond, and this was the year of 1815, which I mentioned. He entered the world a slave, and this was in a county whose most honored writings declare that all men have a right to liberty. And so he was a slave because his countrymen had made it lawful. He says this: I was born a slave. Tyrants who were remorseless and destitute of religion and every principle of humanity, they stood by the couch of my mother, and as I entered the world, before I had done anything to forfeit my right to liberty, and while my soul was yet undefiled by the commission of actual sin, they stretched forth their bloody arms and branded me with the mark of bondage. So he says that they robbed him. They robbed him, and he was considered property. So I really want us to understand some of what this man felt as he dealt with slavery. He talks about the pangs which lacerate the soul. Now, many of us know that the bloody transactions of slavery suggest that people were beat. They were demoralized. Well, he talks about pains that go beyond lacerations that are on the physical body. He talks about pains which lacerate the soul. He was 15 years old, and his master died, his old master. On the death of his old master, his property, the master's property, was inherited by 4 sons. The sons' names were Strawn, Charles, John, and William. And so the human, as well as other types of property, was divided equally amongst these 4 sons. And so he was separated from his father, his mother, his sister, his brother. And he talks about how these separations they were the most severe trial to his feelings which he had ever endured. He says, I was only 15 years of age, but it is as present in my mind as if but yesterday's sun had shone upon the dreadful exhibition. He says his mother was separated from her youngest child, and it was not until she begged so pitifully that she was able to hug her child just once more, to bid her child a farewell embrace. And she had to let go forever. He says that this kind of torture is 1,000-fold more cruel and barbarous than the use of the lash, which lacerates the back, the gashes of the whip, or the cowskin. Those gashes may heal, and the place where is marked in a little while cease to exhibit the signs of what had endured. But the pains which lacerate the soul in consequence of the forcible disruption of parent and the dearest family ties only grow deeper. He said they grow deeper and more piercing as memory fetches from a greater distance the horrid acts by which they have been produced. He talks about these memories and how the tyrant slaveholder regards not even the social or domestic feelings of the slave, and makes divisions according to the moneyed value of these slaves, because they were not deemed as really 100% human. And so these divisions happen without giving the slightest consideration to the domestic or social ties by which the individuals are bound to each other. Indeed, the tyrants, the slaveholders, their idea, their common expression was that ends, you know that N word, ends have no feelings. So again, let's not forget American history that entails pains which lacerate the soul. And then he talks about, as he grows a little older, he talks about images and gathering and preaching and solitude, okay? He says that after he was separated from his family, he's in Richmond, and he has this hearing of all of this great excitement all over town. And he says that he didn't really know what was going on and what was causing the excitement. But what he discovered was the information about Nat Turner's slave rebellion, which happened on August 21st to about August the 23rd, 1831. And so Nat Turner, as many of us know, was executed at age 31 by hanging. And so as he's there, as Henry Brown is there, and he hears all of this excitement, he's like, what's going on? Well, what happened is, although he did not precisely know the cause of the excitement, his master gave a little bit of information and said some of the slaves had plotted to kill their owners. And so he says, I learned that it was the famous Nat Turner's insurrection. Many slaves were whipped, hung, and cut down with the swords in the streets, and some were found away from the quarters after dark because they were shot. And the whole city was in the utmost excitement because of this. And the whites seemed terrified beyond measure. And so great numbers of slaves were half hung during this time. They were half hung, and they were suspended from some tree with a rope about their necks, so adjusted as not quite to be strangled by them. And men and boys would throw eggs at these half-hanging persons. This was a peculiar punishment to slaves. This took place some distance from the city, and was the occasion of enacting of that law by which more than 5 slaves were forbidden. So when I talked about these images, the image was to see these half-hung slaves. And when they did this, it was about also being sure to forbid and to discourage slaves to not be gathered much, even together, unless they were working. And that was silencing even all the colored preachers. So images, gathering, preaching, and then he talks about solitude. He says that during this time, he very seldom heard from his mother. And he says, my feelings were very much tried by the separation which I had thus endured. I missed severely her welcome smile when I returned from my daily task. No one seemed at that time to sympathize with me. And I began to feel indeed that I really was alone in the world. And worse than all, I could console myself with no hope. Not even the most distant, that I should ever see my beloved parents again. So Henry Brown dealt with pains that lacerated the soul, just as other slaves. He dealt with these images, restricted from gathering. And I think many of us know what that's like now that we've experienced COVID-19. No gathering. And even with the preaching, colored persons were not permitted to preach. And then he's dealing with solitude. But what else is Henry Brown? And I'm going to get to that nickname that he has, Box Brown, Henry Box Brown. But the next thing he talks about, one of the other things anyway that I wanted to share with you, was he talked about invoking the authority of heaven in support of slave degrading laws. Listen to this. He said that there was a reverend by the name of Ryland, and he preached for the colored people. He was a professor at the Baptist Seminary near the city of Richmond, and the colored people had to pay him a salary of $700 per year, although they did not choose him and they had the least control over him. This preacher did not consider himself bound to preach regularly, but only when he was not otherwise engaged. So he preached about 40 sermons a year. And he was a zealous supporter of slaveholders' causes, right? And so as far as he could judge, Henry Brown says that this man had no notion whatsoever of pure religion of Jesus Christ. He used to preach from such texts as the epistle to the Ephesians, where St. Paul, he says, servants, be obedient to them that are your masters and mistresses according to the flesh, and submit to them with fear and trembling. He was not ashamed to invoke the authority of heaven in support of the slave degrading laws under which masters could abuse their fellow creatures. Interesting. And not only did Henry deal with that, but as he grew older, he decided to get married. He met a beautiful woman whom he fell in love with. Now, many of us know that when it came to those who were enslaved, marriage was not deemed as lawful, and their marriages were not recognized. And so when he got married, he says that he's married, but there were those, of course, who did not recognize his marriage. This is why many slaves practiced jumping the broom. It was that practice because it was a way of solidifying their union. Well, after 12 years of marriage and having children with this beautiful woman, Henry Brown was separated from his wife and kids. He says, my agony was now complete. Now he's a grown man, and now he's experiencing a different type of separation. She with whom I had traveled the journey of life in chains for the space of 12 years, and the dear little pledges God had given us, I could see plainly must now be separated from me forever. And I must continue desolate and alone to drag my chains through the world. And so he thought, no more will my children be in my sight. No more holding the hand of my wife. For far away in North Carolina swamps, they are going to be taken away. Rays of a hot sun, deprived of a husband's and father's care. Now he received a message. He received a message that if he wished, he could see his wife and children as they were being taken off to North Carolina. And so if he wanted to bid them a last farewell, he could do so by taking his stand on the street where they all would pass on their way to North Carolina. And so he says, I quickly availed myself of this information and placed myself by the side of the street, and soon had the melancholy satisfaction of witnessing the approach of a gang of slaves amounting to 350 in number, marching under the direction of a Methodist minister by whom they were purchased, and amongst which slaves were my wife and children. I stood in the midst of many who, like myself, were mourning the loss of friends and relations, and had come there to obtain one parting look at those whose company they but a short time before had imagined they would always enjoy, but who were without any regard to their own wills, now driven by a tyrant's voice, by the smart of a whip, on their way to another scene of toil, and to them another land of sorrow in a far off southern land. So my brothers and sisters, tomorrow is Father's Day. I want you fathers out there, if you're listening, I want you to think about this scene. He says, these beings were marched with ropes about their necks and staples on their arms. This train of beings was accompanied by a number of wagons loaded with little children of many different families. But what should I now see? In the very foremost wagon, but a little child looking towards me, pitifully calling, Father, Father. This was my eldest child. And I was obliged to look upon my child for the last time. Fathers, tomorrow is Father's Day. I want you to really think about your child being torn from you. Your child passing by in chains. Your child who you will never see again. He says, thus passed my child from my presence. It was my own child. I had loved my child with all fondness of a father, but things were so ordered that I could only say farewell and leave my child to pass in his chains while I looked for the approach of another gang in which, wait, my wife was loaded with chains. So now as this caravan of persons are passing by, he sees his wife, caught her precious face. Oh, gracious heaven, he says, this is my beautiful wife. That glance of agony, may God spare me from ever enduring again. He sees his wife, and so this minister was leading these persons off to North Carolina. Now Henry Brown experiences a different type of separation. And so for a long time, he had been the member of a church choir. Well, in Richmond, after this severe family affliction, which he, discussed, or I discussed just now, he grew away from the church because he began to be suspicious of slave-holding church members. I mean, how could he trust such persons? The cruelties were perpetuated by ministers and church members. He began strongly to suspect the Christianity of slave-holding church members and hesitated much about maintaining his connection with them. This suspicion of these slave-dealing Christians was a means of keeping him from the church. Yes, indeed. He had been away from the church, but then in 1848, Christmas Day, he went to the church because there was a person there by the name of Dr. Smith, who was the conductor of the Underground Railway, who was a member of the choir. And so he promised Dr. Smith that he would show up, and so he did. And after a while, that man, Dr. Smith, who was his friend, that was the very man that he went to when he had this idea. And this is where we get to how Henry Brown gained that name, that to be known as Box, Henry Box Brown, or Henry the Box Brown. Maybe you've heard of him. Maybe you know this story. Well, although Henry Box Brown no longer wanted to be attached to those slave-holding church members, he did not sever his relationship with the Creator. One day while I was at work, he says, and my thoughts were eagerly feasting upon the idea of freedom, I felt my soul called out to heaven to breathe a prayer to the Almighty God. See, he still kept that connection. I prayed fervently that he who seeth in secret and knew the inmost desires of my heart would lend me his aid in bursting my fetters asunder and in restoring me the possession of those rights to be free, which men had robbed me. When the idea certainly flashed across my mind of shutting myself up in a box. Shutting himself up in a box? Yes, shutting myself up in a box and getting myself conveyed as dry goods to a free state. Being now satisfied with his friendship with Dr. Smith, he talked to him about it, and Dr. Smith agreed to have it put at once, this execution of this plan. However, without not calculating, being sure to calculate, if you will, the dangers. But Henry Brown believed that his hatred for slavery was greater than not going through with this plan. And so, what did he do? He wanted to be sure that he procured a box. Yes, he had this idea, and so he knew that he could not live in the box forever, but he wanted to get a good box, a box that he could use. And then he deemed it necessary to get permission to be absent from work, and so he did that. So the box, my brothers and sisters, the box which Henry Brown had procured was 3 feet 1 inch wide, 2 feet 6 inches high, and 2 feet wide. And on the morning of the 29th day of March 1849, he went into the box. And so he bored 3 holes opposite his face for air, and he provided himself a bladder of water. Why did he do that? Well, he provided himself a bladder of water both for the purpose of quenching his thirst and for wetting his face should he feel faint. And so he took a tool with him so that he could drill more holes if he found that he did not have sufficient air. And so know, my brothers and sisters, that he tumbled while traveling. And he even reports that he was upside down for so long at one point that he felt that his eyes were going to bulge out of their sockets. He got so hot at one point that he knew that death must be close. Oh yes, he was in a box, in a dreadful position many times, but he did not forget that he was battling for liberty. And so he felt cold sweat coming over him, which seemed to be a warning that death was about to terminate his earthly miseries. But he feared that, but not more than slavery. And so he continued. So he arrived at one point in the city of Washington, where he was taken from a steamboat and again placed on a wagon, and he was carried to a depot right side up with care. Now this was great because he was able to maintain himself a bit more. But another point came where he says, I was then tumbled into a car with my head downwards again, but the car had not proceeded far before more luggage had been taken in, and then the box got shifted and he was turned right side in position until he remained that way until he got to Philadelphia. So he heard someone at the port say that he had arrived in Philadelphia. There he was, and he says that his heart leaped for joy, and he wondered if any person knew that such a box was there. And so there were folks who were supposed to gather the box, gather him, if you will. He remained at the station because right away that person did not show up. He says, I was only 27 hours in the box. Only 27 hours in the box. I was only 27 hours in the box. Now, how many of us could stand even being 27 hours on a train, or 27 hours in a car, or 27 hours on a bus? He says, I was only 27 hours in the box, though traveling a distance of 350 miles. And so there he is in the box. A number of persons soon collected round the box. So what's that noise he hears? Those are the persons collected around the box after taking it into the house. But as Henry Brown, he did not know what was going on, and so he kept himself quiet. But then he heard a man say, let us rap upon the box and see if he is alive. And immediately they rapped. The rap ensued, and a voice said, trembling, is all right within? To which I replied, all right. The joy of the friends was very great when they heard that I was alive. They soon managed to break open the box, and then came my resurrection from the grave of slavery. And so, my brothers and sisters, as we are commemorating this day, June 19th, let us remember such persons as Henry Box Brown, who resurrected from the grave of slavery by shipping himself to Philadelphia. Oh, I tell you, what freedom looks like for such person, I will never know, because I've never had shackles on my wrist. I've never had shackles on my ankles. I've never had shackles around my neck. But I can tell you that in this life, I have experienced a being in the box, if you will, type of situation. And I suppose, if you would be honest, you've experienced a in the box type of situation yourself. If we live long enough, trouble comes, and we may not be exactly like Henry Box Brown, but we found ourselves in boxes. As we celebrate Juneteenth 2021, I want to ask you, what box have you found yourself in? What box? Have you found yourself in the box of limiting your abilities, the box of limitation? Have you found yourself in the box of denial? Have you found yourself in the box of temptation? Have you found yourself in the box of anger or unforgiveness? Have you found yourself in a box, I'm asking, of bondage? Well, if you have, it's time for you to set yourself free. It's time for you to get out of those boxes. You see, I can tell you that there was a time when I was in a box. You know, if we're not careful, we'll allow people to put us in boxes, and we allow our own thinking to put us in a box. I tell you, on this day and every day, one of the things that I love to celebrate is my heritage, my culture. And I've learned to not be in a box when it comes to celebrating that. We all should celebrate who God has chosen to make us. And so I make no apologies because I'm no longer in a box, because of what people may think or what people may say. And so I want to liberate you on today to come out of the box. I came out of the box. You see, I no longer apologize, for example, for my black thoughts. I don't apologize for my black history or my black loyalties or my black joy, because I realize that I don't have to be in a box because of even my culture. What kind of box are you in today? Well, I thank you for spending some time with me, and I hope that whatever your box may be, that you will break out even on today. It would be in vain to celebrate freedom if you yourself are not actually free. Be free, my brothers and sisters. Happy Juneteenth, 2021.